What's going on, YouTube? This is Newo, and I'm a techno artist from Los Angeles, as you know. Thank you for everyone who has been liking my videos and subscribing to my channel. I think I'm currently at 49 subscribers, so that means one more, and we're at 50, which is a big number for me. And I know I'm not really doing crazy numbers on YouTube. That's not why I'm here. I'm here because I love what I do. I love making music. I love techno music. I love specifically minimal techno, but I do all kinds of techno. And that's what today's video is about. I want to discuss a layered kick design for a more harder, faster, modern style of techno. Now, this kick is a kick that I actually used on a record. It's from a track called New Metropolis, which is with 92 Jaylani. And this will be coming out early June on Ambivalent on his label, which is called Valence. And we have 3 tracks coming out on that label. But this one is a standout track. I think it's going to be the title track. And it's a really fast track. I think it's like 136-ish beats per minute. It's kind of almost like trance. And that's the thing. A lot of modern techno is leaning towards trance territory in the sense of like the kicks are really tight. The kicks are really hard. It's very fast, very aggressive, and very like rolling, kind of that like chugga 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 chugga. It's almost like an industrial trance sound. And that's what this kick is today. And the way I achieved this kick is by layering sounds. Now, this is something I've experimented with in the past 2 years of not just using one sample when you're designing drums, layering a couple samples. And of course, you can do this also with synthesis. Like you can, make a drum in a synthesizer and then print that out and then continue to add layers to it. That's one way to do it. But for sake of example, let me show you what the actual kick sounds like. So it's a very tight, very hard kick. And that's also the difference between like a techno kick and a trance kick. A techno kick is a little dirtier. But the way I got the click on this kick is I took some different samples, and I can't stress enough the importance of when you are looking for samples, go through and listen for very specific elements. When I was finding the top of this kick, I was looking for a very specific type of click. And here's what we have. And as you can see, it's not much, and I have it filtered out, so I really am taking off pretty much all of it. We're just getting that top region really around, between 1 and 10K. That's what we want. Now, another note is if we go into quarter notes on the grid, notice how it's not perfectly lined up to the grid. It's coming in a couple milliseconds before, and that's very important because you want almost like a pre-transient to happen. And now the second layer is a little bit more of the body of the kick. Now, when I was looking for samples to design this kick, I, again, was very intentional, and I didn't want to do that much processing because what you need to remember is when you're looking for samples, all of those samples are both already mixed, and in some cases, they're already mastered. So you really don't want to like over-process anything. Let's hear the second kick for the mid layer and see what that sounds like. So a little more knock, a little more of a thump. Right? But it doesn't have that much low end. And that's what we want. We want something that's going to round it out. And also, I should note, this one is not coming in on the grid either. This one is coming in a couple milliseconds before even that top click. And what that does is it tricks the listener's ear because a lot of sound design is actually just creating almost like an auditory illusion. And so that's what we're doing here. We're layering things in very intentionally by the milliseconds. And when I was designing this kick, I did experiment with shifting things a few milliseconds left or right to see what sounded best. And in this instance, this is what sounded best. So now we have like the layers of the kick that lead to a more knocky kind of kick. And you can ever so slightly hear that top click come in. And that's all we want. You want it barely tucked in there, just enough so that if you mute it, you will notice that it's gone. Now let's hear what the bottom layer sounds like. And for sake of example, let me take off the distortion. So the distortion is just beefing it up a little bit. And you'll see here, I have just a very slight amount. It's only at 2.5. It goes all the way up, I think, to 11. This distortion plugin, if you've seen any of my other videos, you've seen this plugin before. One thing I want to talk about, and the reason I brought this up, is as a producer, it's very important that you keep your sound consistent. So, for example, when you listen to a track by deadmau5, and I just use that example because he's my all-time favorite producer. When you listen to a track by deadmau5, you know it's a deadmau5 track. You know it's a deadmau5 track because it's almost like he's typing in the same font for each track. And so like music is a message, right? And he could have a different message with each song, but because it's been typed out in the same font, there's a familiarity to it. And that's basically what we're doing here when we are intentional about plugins. So stick with plugins that you really like. Don't overthink it. Stick with plugins that you know you can get results with, that you are happy with. And that's the most important thing, that you enjoy the way your sound design comes out. When you're using plugins, you want to have consistency. And another way that I did that is I took all these kicks and I routed them to a through track. And I used some of the same plugins I use on other projects. And one of those is the Smack Attack plugin. Now, it's just a transient shaper. It just gets a little more click out of the kick. And what it does also is because those samples are not coming in exactly on the grid, it's almost like a glue compressor. It kind of just meshes everything together nicely. I also tried using the R bass, but I didn't really love how it ended up sounding, so I just bypassed it. Another note that I just realized is notice the phase of these waveforms. You want your layered samples to be in phase, because if they're out of phase, they're not going to punch. They're not going to knock. It's not as important when you're looking for a clicky sound because it's such a short sound that it's not something that's going to have like a noticeable, I guess, waveform. But when you get into bass frequencies, those are just physically larger sound waves. And those sound waves need to be in sync. They kind of, oscillate together. If those were not in sync, you would not get the same amount of punch. So that's very important to note before you start printing anything or before you start routing samples together. So now I took those and I printed that. And you can see the samples glued together because those little pre-transients are coming in. And if we go to the actual grid, which is right here, there's those couple milliseconds before, which are very important. Now, also, one thing I should note, don't cut it here, right? And then start copying it. Copy before and then print like that so that it comes in. And if you have to, like, let's say you want to put it on the 1, you have to slide it over and make sure that you keep that little pre-transient for the sake of just a very punchy kick. And you'll see here, I kept a little bit before so that I could make sure it comes in on time. If we go to the plugins on the final print track, what we have is an EQ, and I actually didn't end up doing anything. I experimented with just different, sweeps and whatnot to see if there was any frequencies I could take out, but I just left it on because I was like, maybe I'll come back to it. Then we have some more lo-fi distortion. And that's essentially acting both to beef it up, but also kind of like the Smack Attack, it's kind of gluing it together. The next thing I have is the Kramer. I just have the top end kind of tamed down a little bit, and then I boosted ever so slightly the mid-range, and I really boosted the bass. And then I have the Tokyo Nova, and all that's doing is really, you could do any EQ on this, but I use it because it has a sharper slope. And all that does is it just opens it up. It adds more headroom to the overall mix, and it lets the kick actually breathe a little bit more. Now, the last thing I have is just after that cut, a little bit more distortion, because you do get some character after cutting out lows and then adding in more harmonics with distortion. So that's what I have for that. Now, when it came to actually mixing the actual record in the studio, we did that on the API, and I would recommend to go check out the studio video with 92J Lonnie in terms of how we approached our mix. But we used the distressor on that. We also used the API EQ. And then I think the only other thing we did, if I recall correctly, in the studio is we used the FabFilter Pro Q, which is really just another EQ, but it's a little more surgical. And so the digital EQ for surgical purposes combined with the analog console EQ, and that's more for harmonic, like sculpting purposes. That combined with the distressor, which the distressor really just adds knock, it adds punch. It's another type of glue component. What I will say is this is not the final version of the kick. This is almost like the final draft of the kick, and then the way we got the exact tone that we wanted in relation to the overall mix of the record was by taking it into the studio on the console. And that's something I also want to emphasize is never get too comfortable with how your kick sounds, always be open to EQing it a little bit, or it might even be just down to volume. You might design a track and get an arrangement going, and then you realize the kick just needs to be turned down a little bit. And I think that's something producers often overlook, is jumping to EQ before actually just checking to see if it's loud enough or if it's too loud. You could have a kick that sounds perfectly mixed, but if it's, a couple decibels too loud, then there's no point in like changing the tonality of it by carving out frequencies with EQ and whatnot. Layered kicks are something that I don't do every single time. It kind of depends on the track. And so for this track, New Metropolis, we wanted like a really aggressive, really hard kick. And that's where this technique comes in. Let me know if you would like to see any other videos related to drum design, maybe hi-hat design. I could do that in another tutorial coming soon. And thank you so much. I truly appreciate everyone who comes to my channel. So have a great rest of your day.